Hello everyone, welcome to my book channel. I'm Lu, and today I'm wrapping up all of my November readings. So during the past month, I've only read new releases, meaning brand new books that just hit the market in 2025. So I know it's the middle of December and sorry for the delay of this video, but I just got over being sick and it's good to be back, and I'm happy to be reviewing a lot of the books that you've probably been hearing about all year. And maybe this video will help you decide whether you want to pick up or gift some of these titles that have become viral sensations. So let's get started right away with probably the most talked about, the most hyped publication of 2025, and that is Katabasis by R.F. Kuang. This is the brand new publication of R.F. Kuang, who is also the author of the popular trilogy Babel and Yellowface. The protagonist of this story, Alice Law, was a graduate student studying analytical magic at Cambridge, and at the very beginning of the story, she was getting ready to go to hell to save the soul of her academic advisor, Professor Grimes. And as she was drawing up a pentagram in chalk, stepping in, her academic rival Peter showed up, noticed what she was about to do, and decided to join her. I think once we say it out loud, it's pretty obvious that for two living people to willingly go to hell is a very bad idea. However, these two characters seemingly made no hesitation, and they both just jumped into hell with both feet. And as the story unfolds, as these two characters are navigating the very confusing landscape of hell, it's slowly revealed why they were both so convinced that they have to do this and they have to pull this advisor back, and what were the events leading up to this decision. So at this point, you've probably already heard a lot about this book, and people saying that it is a little bit too dense, it contains too many references to classics, mythology, foreign languages, and so I think some people said you need a graduate degree to be able to understand this book, and I don't think that's the case. So the structure of hell in this book more or less follows Dante's Inferno in that there are different circles in hell, and each circle has a specific sin or crime that's being punished. For example, desire or violence or tyranny or cruelty. And as someone who has never actually read the Inferno in full, I didn't have any trouble following the structure of the narrative or the structure of hell in this story. And although certain specific references are made to very classic or obscure writing, I don't think it was that much trouble just taking a minute to pause and looking up what the author is referring to. And even though I didn't know a lot of the mythological figures that are being referenced that are related to hell or witchcraft, I don't think that not knowing that hindered my understanding of the story itself. I think another thing that a lot of readers may have found challenging was that there's a lot of references to math and logic. For example, the concept of hyperbolic space when Peter and Alice were trying to debate over the actual geographical structure of hell and which direction they should go and how to reach the next court. There's a lot of kind of theoretical geometrical discussions. And also a lot of the times they were able to pass through a court in hell by solving a logic puzzle or by solving a logical contradiction. But again, I don't think you need to fixate on those concepts so much to be able to follow the plot. Like, for example, when hyperbolic space was involved, even the characters were confused. And I think that may have been the point of why the author included it, is that some of these like highly advanced academic research subjects are just so theoretical and so difficult to understand that people just, I guess, kind of get one-tracked into researching them and studying them just for study's sake. And even very advanced scholars and academics have trouble understanding them. And when it comes to the logic, I think you can settle with just knowing that the characters have solved a problem and they are able to move on. And you can always look up what the logical concepts mean, but even if you don't have an understanding of it, I think the point of those is just they are obstacles that are placed in the characters' ways, and they're supposed to solve these problems and pass through the obstacle using their intellect. I think that's the point of including so many advanced math and logic concepts concepts in this book. And overall, I would say the central theme of this book is actually a critique of academia itself. I mean, at one point, she even compared hell to a campus. I think what the author is trying to say that a lot of this highly competitive pursuit of higher academic goals are hellish for the people that are deep in it. There is so much intense competition between the students that have already achieved a very high level of academic success, and they've given up so much to get to that point, and yet they still need to compete with someone else for what feels like a very small, very limited number of quota to be able to, for example, secure a teaching job or advance further in their professional field. And there's a lot of hypocrisy, nepotism, misogyny, female scholars having to deal with very inappropriate rumors of them having reached their level of success because they have been involved with certain professors and things like that. And I think what's crucial in this story is the psychology of the characters to help people outside of academia see what's really going on inside the minds of these scholars that have gotten into these highly abstract, highly competitive fields and feeling like their life is hellish and there's no easy way out. And actually, when it comes to character relationships, I think I preferred Katabasis to some of R.F. Kuang's previous works. Like, for example, in the Poppy War trilogy, when the relationship between Ren and Nnedi and Alton were involved, and certain times there was discussion of romance and love, but there was also clearly an element of abuse in there that I just found kind of problematic. Whereas in Katabasis, it's very clear in the beginning of the story that Alice and Peter are very competitive and they are strong academic rivals. And I suppose there is a little bit of hostility between them, but that just comes from that academic competitiveness. And as the story goes on, as they both navigate hell together and having to work together, they are communicating more and they're sharing more about themselves and their past with the other person. And that communication eventually led to this great turning point in the story when it comes to the relationship between them. And you can see these characters handling their relationship with a lot more self-awareness and a lot more maturity compared to some of the other character relationships in R.F. Kuang's past writings. And as they are getting to know each other better and gaining a deeper sense of friendship, they are also reflecting on their relationship with Professor Grimes, and they're slowly starting to see the truth of their, I suppose, attachment or perceived attachment to this professor and what kind of person he really is, and all of the problems in their own conception of this professor and how hard they worked just to try to impress this person. And as they slowly become a little bit more disillusioned about this endeavor, they also know themselves better and they understand themselves better. I think that reflection really made Peter and Alice better people. And I'm really happy to see that there's a sense of character growth in this story, which I feel like was missing in a lot of her past writing. So overall, I would say don't go into this book expecting to read a straightforward fantasy or a straightforward romance, because neither of those is the focus of the story. I would say the author is really using hell as a metaphor to critique academia itself and to dissect the psychology of highly competitive scholars, their frustration, confusion, at times even desperation. And although this story might require a little bit of patience to get through, I feel like as readers, we probably can't help pausing every time you see something that you didn't know and just want to look it up. But even with that, I still think overall it was an enjoyable reading experience, and I really think the characters in this story showed a lot of growth and maturity compared to some of R.F. Kuang's previous writings. One Day, Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This by Omar Akkad. This book is the winner of the 2025 National Book Award for Nonfiction. It is a combination of a personal memoir and a political critique of the Western apathy and complicity in the genocide in Palestine. In this book, the author examines he and his family's immigrant experience from Egypt to Qatar and then later to Canada and the United States, combined with his long journalistic career observing international politics, while also taking account of and analyzing current affairs in Gaza and all of the atrocities that have been committed against the Palestinian people. There are a lot of important ideas in this book, so I will try to distill and summarize some of the key ideas in this book. I think one of the things that the author was trying to do is to kind of diagnose the current state of things, how we reached this point of apathy and inaction, how a lot of not only news outlets, but powerful politicians and very influential writers and artists are really evading the issue. They're kind of almost struggling to even point out that what is happening in Gaza is genocide. And the writer makes the following observation. So I'm reading from page 68. This is not some abstraction, but a very real expression of power. The privilege of describing a thing vaguely, incompletely, dishonestly is inseparable from the privilege of looking away. I think the author is saying that a lot of this apathy and inaction comes from looking at this issue from a safe distance. When people are not directly and personally affected by all of the atrocities, then they kind of have the privilege of looking away and evading the issue. Whereas the people that live in Palestine and really need some sort of solidarity and support really cannot possibly look away from the genocide. He mentioned some of the very brutal details of what's taking place in Gaza. I think one of the examples that really stood out to me was a 5-year-old calling for help from a vehicle when that vehicle had been shot something like 355 times. And then the ambulance that was on the way to rescue them was also attacked and destroyed. So for the people where all of this is local to them, they simply don't have the privilege of looking away. And another reason that the author points out is that the West had gotten used to seeing people from that region of the world as other, or even going so far as seeing them as lesser humans. So he had personally experienced a lot of discrimination, especially in like the post 9/11 world, where there's a lot of, I suppose, phobia towards people of Arab ethnicities. So I think he's saying that when the largely white Western world don't identify with the victims, they also don't feel any kind of urgency to end their suffering. And he also critiques a lot of hypocrisy in American liberalism, where the Democratic Party had kind of become more concerned with looking like that they're on the right side of history, of looking like that they are the lesser evil, rather than really truly standing up to power and doing like definitive actions to end extremism and stand up against fascism. And he reasons that this is because politicians primarily either serve self-interest or serve monetary interest. There's a lot of financial backing that the Democratic Party is simply too weak to walk away from. I mean, there's certainly a lot of money in arms spending and defense contracts and all of those. And he points out the specific example of AOC, who we see as pretty much on the most liberal spectrum of American politics. And even she is only dissociating herself from what's happening in Gaza rather than taking a definitive stance against it. So all of this wishy-washy attitude, kind of hiding from the issue, trying to look like the lesser evil, is really distancing the Democratic Party from its base, which led to a lot of the political losses that they have experienced. So then even the most liberal faction, let's say, of American politics that we theoretically should have been able to count on to stand up against genocide are not going to do that because they're held back by concerns of interest. And this argument really reminded me of the recent New York mayoral debate that I had been following. I think at one point the candidates were asked the question about like what foreign visit they wanted to take. And basically like everyone other than Mamdani was insisting that they wanted to go to Israel. And Mamdani answered with something like, I would stay right here and just serve the people of New York City and of the 5 boroughs. And then the moderators and the other panelists really gave him a hard time, which was just a ridiculous piece of political theater, because the people are voting for the mayor of a specific city that are supposed to serve that city. I mean, the mayor of New York City is not a diplomatic post. It's not his job to be like some kind of an ambassador and choose like foreign allies for the United States. And I feel like we're really seeing the author's argument just play out in real life of like how much these politicians were leashed by financial interest. So those are some of the most poignant ideas in his analysis that are very urgent for people to read right now. However, on a personal level, I don't feel like I really enjoyed his writing style. I think there are just certain instances where some people's writing style just don't really connect with you. I do feel like this is probably a personal and subjective impression because not only did this book receive the National Book Award, it was also very, very highly rated across multiple platforms. I think it's currently holding 4.6 stars on both Amazon and Goodreads. So I would say the vast majority of readers probably connected with this book more than I did. I think part of my issue with this book stemmed from not really having the right expectation. I was expecting like a more direct analysis of the current state of Gaza and maybe some of the historical background of the region. But I had felt that most of this book was a personal memoir that's mostly like personal anecdotes of family history and journalistic experiences. And he drew a lot of conclusions from these experiences that also apply to what's currently happening. So a lot of the facts and examples that back his arguments and his political critique are drawn from the last few decades instead of directly from the current state of Palestine. And also just on a sentence-to-sentence and paragraph-to-paragraph level, I felt a little bit confused and frustrated by the writing. I don't know if it's just because I don't typically read heavily political writing, so I'm not familiar with this style, but I will read you an example. So this is a paragraph from page 138. One of the most damaging, longest-lasting consequences of the War on Terror years is an utter obliteration of the obvious moral case for nonviolence. The argument that violence in any form debases us and marks the instant failure of all involved is much more difficult to make when the state regularly engages in or approves of wholesale violence against civilians and combatants alike. Instead, the case for nonviolence becomes, in the ugliest way, pragmatic. The state wants violence because in that playing field it maintains every advantage, from bigger guns to total immunity to the privilege of perpetual victimhood. So I have read this paragraph 3 times and I'm not sure I understood it. And there are a lot of examples like this where I feel like there's very dense commentary that kind of flew over my head. And personally, I just didn't really connect with the writing. And the paragraph after that is personal anecdotes, so it didn't really help. But I mean, books like these are probably not really meant for a sense of enjoyment. It's not like sci-fi fantasy where you escape into a fictional world. I think it's more meant to be thought-provoking and it's meant to force the reader to confront a certain issue. So that's more important than a personal feeling of enjoyment. But despite my personal confusions, I still highly recommend that you check out this book. I think even if you wrestle with the text, the ideas behind it are very worth it because they're very poignant and very thought-provoking. And needless to say, this is a very urgent and very timely piece of nonfiction to read. And I also watched the award ceremony and I really enjoyed watching the author's acceptance speech. Like, he's clearly a very humble person and he's very non-pretentious and he's like deeply affected by this issue, and it's just really refreshing to see someone take such a clear stance for what they believe in. So I highly recommend that you support this author and check out his work. Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is the story of Joan Goodwin, who is the Capcom of Mission Control at NASA. And at the very beginning of this story, she was communicating with the astronauts on the Navigator shuttle as they are about to release a satellite. So something had malfunctioned with the clamps holding the satellite to the shuttle, and a couple of the astronauts had to take a spacewalk to manually fix and release these clamps. And it seems like the crisis was averted, but then something very unexpected happened and put the safety of the entire shuttle and all of the astronauts at risk. So this story is structured between 2 separate timelines, the present being 1984 when we're following this Navigator mission, and the other timeline being all of the events leading up to this point, from Joan Goodwin being inspired to join NASA to her entire journey of becoming an astronaut and then becoming a Capcom in Mission Control. And it follows her relationship with all of the astronauts that are currently on the Navigator shuttle. So Griff, Lydia, and especially specifically Vanessa Ford, who became very close with Joan. So although this story is titled Atmosphere, a love story, I don't think it's a romance. I think the focus of this story is really sculpting all of these characters and developing the relationship between them. The dialogues, the interactions, the personalities of all of these characters, and as readers, you slowly learn who they are and slowly become attached to various degrees to these characters. What really impressed me about this story is how real it felt. So I think the author did such a good job creating compelling characters that feel complete and they really feel like real people. I think one of the first things that I Googled about this book when I was listening to it was Joan Goodwin a real person? Because it really felt that way. And I think what I found was that she was inspired by Sally Ride, but it was not really a shot-by-shot remake of Sally's life, if that makes sense. The events and the characters in this story are fictional, but they did come from that inspiration. And everything about Joan, like all of her ambitions and moments of self-doubt and her kind of slightly troubled relationship with her sister Barbara and how much she loved her little niece Frances, all of these things come together to create a really complete and really vivid character. And as you see Griff, Lydia, and Vanessa through Joan's eyes, you really start understanding how she feels about these characters. And it did become quite painful knowing that someone had died at the very beginning of the story. And then as the story goes on and you learn more about that person, you realize that you're starting to grow attached to a character that you know had already died. It was a really emotional journey listening to this book. And overall, this character definitely had like moments of vulnerability, moments where she did things that really seemed irrational looking on from outside, but also like her motivation and discipline and the strength of her pursuit are all very inspiring. And after finishing this story, I learned that there's actually a documentary about Sally Ride's life. It's titled Sally, and I'm definitely looking forward to watching that very, very soon. So overall, Atmosphere was another book that really surprised me this month. So I went into it knowing very little. I knew it was a story about space and there is an element of romance, but I really didn't know anything else. But after finishing it, it really felt like a real story that happened between real people. It was very compelling and it was a great, enjoyable listening/reading experience. So I would 100% say that Atmosphere was worth the hype. Seascraper by Benjamin Wood. This story is set in 1960s England in a fictional coastal town called Longferry. The protagonist Thomas makes a living as a shanker, so this is the same profession as his grandfather. And it means that every morning he takes his horse and cart through the drizzly, cold seacoast of England and quite literally scrapes the sea for shrimp to make a very meager living. And after a day's hard work, he's been covered by grime and fishy odor from this gruesome work, and he takes his horse back through town, getting splashed by passing traffic, and he also has to haggle for a fair price for his catch. And in the evening, he returns home where he lives with his mother, who is quite the character. So she's an older lady, but she never lacks gentleman callers from town. And at night, he has nightmares of horrendous pollution poisoning the sea and destroying his livelihood, but more importantly, he harbors dreams of becoming a musician. He has this acoustic guitar, he sings and plays, and he is scheduled to appear in this talent show at a local pub. And one evening after he comes home, he was met by a strange man waiting on the couch with his mother. So he initially assumed that this was just one of her whimsy boyfriends, but turns out the man claims to be a successful producer from the United States, and he offers Thomas a generous sum of money to take him out to the seacoast and take photographs and basically scout for a filming location. So the story unfolds as this mysterious stranger reignites a sense of hope in Thomas and he dares to dream again. This novel was longlisted for the 2025 Booker Prize and unfortunately it did not make the shortlist. However, just while I was following the award and all of the nominations, I think Seascraper was an easy favorite among all of the reviewers that I have watched, and after listening to this story, I wholeheartedly agree. This is such a well-crafted and beautifully written story. It's only 170 something pages, but it takes the reader into this remote, dreamlike landscape, and it's kind of like watching a dream unfolding through rain and fog, and you can see the ocean in the distance, and you can feel this hopefulness of the characters. It was a really great reading experience, or I should say listening experience. I especially want to recommend the audiobook of Seascraper because it is read by the author himself, and he did such a great job that I really think rivaled professional audiobook readers. So as I was listening to the book when the American producer was introduced, I had thought, wow, British actors are just so good at doing an American accent. I feel like they're better at doing an American accent than American actors doing a British accent. And then I realized it's not an actor, it's the author himself, and he did such a convincing job of portraying all of the different characters that it really turned it into kind of a cinematic experience listening to this book. And also, more importantly, he sings the songs that are put into this book. So when you're reading it, you will probably be reading the lyrics written out, but when you listen to the audiobook, you would hear him play guitar and sing the songs himself, so you can really experience what the songs in the Seascraper novel should really sound like. And I think the title of the novel, Seascraper, is actually the name of one of the songs. So I think listening to the audiobook really made this a complete and unforgettable experience. So needless to say, I really enjoyed Seascraper. This is one of my best reads of the month, probably of the year, and definitely one of the best audiobooks I have ever listened to. It's such a well-crafted plot line with great deep layers of metaphor and symbolism in the story, and the author did such a phenomenal job performing the book. So please check out Seascraper, tell all your friends about it. I really think this book is a modern classic in the making. It is inspiring, it is gentle and melancholic, and overall it was a fantastic reading experience. Flesh by David Sazloy. This is the winner of the 2025 Booker Prize. It is a coming-of-age story of Istvan, who at the beginning of the story was 15-year-old, living with his mother in a flat in Hungary. He was not having a lot of luck with people his own age. He was having trouble making friends and could not really attract the attention of girls at his school. And one day his mother suggested that he help an older lady that lives across from them. So she was 42, as later revealed in the story. He helped her carry her groceries back to the flat. She offered him some food and then very casually asked, "Can I kiss you?" And before he could say anything, she just kissed him anyway. And from there, their relationship kind of escalated. There's a lot more intimacies that take place between this adult that's in her 40s and a 15-year-old boy, and the author did not shy away from describing all of these intimate scenes in very, I think, graphic detail. So it really made the opening chapter of this story very difficult to read because the consent is so dubious and there's this quite obvious age and power imbalance in the story. Istvan had a lot of trouble saying no and standing up for himself, but also he couldn't help being physically aroused from these intimacies that he was having with this older woman. And gradually he got it into his head that he was in love with her, which led to a very accidental and tragic confrontation with her husband and landed Istvan in a juvenile correction facility. After that, he joined the army, and his experience in the army led him to become a security driver in the upper-class society of London. This novel was not a great reading experience for me, not just because the issue with the opening that I just mentioned. I have already posted a detailed review that I will link below. A major issue that I had with this story was most of the dialogue was very choppy and very reluctant. I read you a sample of it in my original review, where a lot of the character exchanges were just, yes, he says, no, she says, I don't know, he says, okay, she says. So that kind of really choppy, uninteresting sentences permeate the entire story. And another issue that I had with it is that there are massive gaps in the narrative. A lot of fundamentally character developing or world-changing events were skipped over and only later mentioned in passing by characters that are having those very boring and choppy exchanges. And overall, the story was quite depressing because Istvan kind of just remained this same repressed, reserved, and depressed person kind of throughout the entire story. story. However, I do think the ending of this story was quite good. So this novel has a total of 10 chapters, and in the middle of chapter 8, I feel like there was a real turning point, and he had this moment of self-reflection that I thought was quite valuable. And in chapter 9, he made a decision that was fundamental to another human being's life that really showed his conscience and goodness, regardless of all the wrongs that had been done to him and all the wrongs that he had done. So I did have quite positive feelings about the ending, but the reading experience of this novel overall was quite negative for me. It kind of felt like a bad attempt at a Dickensian story because the characters were uninteresting and the dialogues were so reluctant. It's kind of like any two characters in this story talking to each other was like pulling teeth, and it was just overall very unpleasant to read. And the obsession with adding graphic, explicit sexual details in this story really didn't help either. So overall, this was far from my favorite Booker Prize read, and I think personally I would probably have given the win to Seascraper, with Audition by Katie Kitamura being a close second. I think maybe the author was trying to create a poignant story of what it's like to kind of drift through the world like a piece of flesh and not really finding much meaning in one's existence, but that idea in itself is also very bleak and depressing, and personally it's not something that I would be drawn to. So despite the fact that I liked the ending of this story, I really did not enjoy the reading experience overall. Red City by Marie Lu. This is a story of alchemy that takes place in Angel City, California, and it introduces us to Sam and Ari when they were children. So as a young girl, Sam was watching her mother working very hard at a Chinese restaurant. She was enduring a very harsh boss, but she always had this talent of turning any kind of leftover food material into delicious meals for the mother and daughter. And one day, two very well-dressed men walked into the restaurant wearing these strange gold pins on their clothes, and they were talking about someone called Diamond Taylor. So the boss of this restaurant, who's normally very harsh to Sam's mom, was practically cowering and just acting very sycophantish to these men, and their meal was also free. And at one point, Sam could have sworn that one of the men turned a fork into a spoon. And where Sam was always invisible at school, Ari was always noticed whenever he went. He had large bright eyes and very nice curly hair, so he always attracted a lot of attention. And he was originally from Gujarat, India. And although like Sam, he was not from a wealthy family, he had this mysterious benefactor that took him practically off the streets. And he could have sworn his benefactor Rudra turned a handful of mulch into ice cream. So that is the key to alchemy in this story, which is transmutation. The alchemists in this world are capable of turning anything into anything else. And the principles of alchemy are deeply rooted in chemistry. So I guess it's another example of sufficiently advanced science and technology looking like magic. And because of this transformative magic, alchemists in this world wield a lot of invisible power. They kind of play a part in political changes and regime shifts behind the scenes. And there are many powerful and shadowy alchemy syndicates in this world that effect economic and political changes from behind the scenes, and they are unknown and untouchable to normal people. And their powers are enhanced by a drug called sand. So the production and distribution of sand is a major point of contention between these syndicates as well. So although Sam and Ari had this strong connection between them, even as children, I mean, Ari noticed Sam when no one else did, and they would write letters to each other. So there's really this wholesome friendship and love between them. But because they both come from a rather powerless and impoverished background, they were swept into this world of alchemy and ended up on opposite sides of a war between syndicates. So this is a romantasy, so there are going to be some spicy, explicit scenes. So don't give this to someone who's not aware of that or someone who's too young to comprehend that, for example. Definitely be aware that there will be explicit details in this book. I didn't mind it so much. In some books, I feel like explicit sex scenes just don't fit. But here it's a romantasy, and I don't think the author unnecessarily protracted these scenes or included too much anatomical detail that would make it terribly unpleasant. And also, like during the scene where what's happening was not consensual because someone was forced by alchemy, the author did not go into any detail of the actions that were happening. So I really appreciated that. So what I really enjoyed about this story was the world building and the character relationships. I really like the design of the magical system in this fantasy. I feel like the transmutation was very clearly defined and it's very easy to imagine. It is the transformation of matter into different matter. And that's also kind of what happens in a chemical reaction is some substances react to each other and they turn into an entirely different substance. So all of that really made sense to me. And I feel like it's clearly defined and it's not like an all-encompassing, all-powerful type of magic. It's a very specific thing. And also the portrayal of these dark and seedy alchemy syndicates, kind of like mafia-like world, was really compelling to me. I feel like there's this real sense of greed of no amount of power is ever enough. Like people have this amazing power of transmuting matter, but they use it to acquire wealth and political influence and peddle drugs. And even the people that use their transmuting power for healing end up working for these syndicates and become like practically mob doctors. So there's a devastating kind of darkness in this world that is all-encompassing and almost misanthropic in its portrayal. Marie Lu is always very good at depicting these very dystopian setting and marginalized characters. I think in Legend, one of the main characters was also like a teenage criminal, kind of a kid on the streets. And if I remember correctly, in Sky Hunter, I think the leading female character was mute, so like she couldn't speak, and the leading male character was like a prisoner that was about to be executed. So she writes these marginalized, powerless characters and put them in a very dark dystopian setting, and somehow she's still able to create like very wholesome and heartwarming connection between these characters, as in the case of Sam and Ari. So although there's like explicit scenes happening that's not between these characters, you still feel like the love and connection between Sam and Ari was the only true love in this story, and I really liked that aspect of this narrative. So overall, I really enjoyed Red City. I didn't mind the spicy scenes. I really loved the world building and the character relationship, and I'm definitely eagerly awaiting the sequel of this story. Breath of the Dragon by Shannon Lee and Fonda Lee. This is the brand new fantasy release co-authored by Fonda Lee, who is the author of the Jade City trilogy, and Shannon Lee, who is Bruce Lee's daughter. So this story really celebrates Bruce Lee's legacy, and it combines martial arts with fantasy elements. The story began at the home of June and Sai, who were identical twins living in East Longhan, which is the eastern half of the fictional Longhan Empire. And Sai was breath-marked, meaning that on his body there is a pattern of dragon scales, and he has a very special ability. So there were many children that were born in this empire that had dragon scales on their body and special abilities, and they were required to report this special ability to the government officials as young as when they're 6 years old. So on this autumn day, two government officials called Aspects of Virtue had come to their home to collect Sai because of his special ability, and they were admonishing their mother for not reporting this ability sooner. So June was of course unhappy with his twin brother being taken away, and he had accidentally revealed that he had been learning martial arts from their father. And this was a grave mistake because martial arts was forbidden in East Longhan. So because of this, Sai and their mother were both taken away to train Sai's special ability, and June and his father were banished from East Longhan and exiled into the West. However, in the West, martial arts was actually prized and revered, and they held an annual tournament to find the best martial artist to guard something called the Scroll of Heaven. But because of this instance that led to their family separating, June's father was distraught, and he only worked as a stunt instructor and stuntman at a theater, and he never really became, like a competitive martial artist or anything, and he refused to continue teaching June as well. But June had always had dreams of becoming a champion martial artist, and he decided to do whatever it takes to get to this tournament and to compete to become the guardian of the Scroll of Heaven. There were a few things about this book that immediately stood out to me as being very well done. Like, for example, the portrayal of Chinese culture when it comes to family values and family relationships, and also the very detailed choreography of martial arts. It's not very often that I read a fantasy and feel like I'm actually watching one of those like classic 90s kung fu movies and really watching a fight happen like from move to move, and everything is described in so much detail. So I think if you are a fan of martial arts and seeing martial arts in film, you would really enjoy this book because it really truly respects Bruce Lee's legacy, and it did a great job portraying martial arts in all its glory. However, that being said, there were a few things about this book that I didn't really enjoy. The first thing being the pacing, which is partially my fault because I had gone into it expecting this book to be a standalone, and the book kind of spent something like 10 chapters just on the journey of June to get to that tournament, and then I think 20 chapters covering the tournament itself. So as I was reading on, I was like, why do I feel like this story is moving so slowly? And I actually felt like the part of the book after the tournament was more tense and more interesting because it was a little bit more unexpected. So like, we know that June is the protagonist, and even though I feel like the book tried very hard to paint him as the underdog, you know, he doesn't have dragon scales on his body, he doesn't have special abilities, and his father had refused to continue teaching him martial arts, so everything would indicate that he is an underdog. However, there is that main character effect, like because he is the protagonist, I'm expecting, you know, plot armor, and I'm just expecting victory and success from this central character. So although during this lengthy journey there were a lot of obstacles that were thrown into his journey, and there were some financial troubles, and during the tournament a lot of other competitors were breathmarked and they had special abilities and they were painted as incredibly like magically strong, I just always expected the hero to win because he's the hero. So I guess that feeling of like predictability was really my fault, because as I read on towards the end, I realized this was not a standalone. So this was actually the first installment in a planned series. I just wasn't aware of that. And actually, when you really think about it, that political divide that was set up, like the East and West parts of the empire being separated by an impenetrable wall, and the East forbidding martial arts, the West prizing it. So that conflict and divide, and how people from the East and the West regard each other with a certain sense of suspicion and hostility, and a lot of propaganda placed into it. So that political setup was very crucial and very important, I think, for the continuation of the story. So I guess feeling a little bit impatient throughout most of the book was really my fault of not having the correct expectation of how this narrative sits in a planned series. And another aspect that I didn't really love was that there's a love triangle in this book that to me felt a little bit forced. Like, two of the characters had worked together and journeyed together, and they really developed this sense of attachment, I guess. And then another character showed up and it was kind of a bit of a love at first sight, I guess. And I did feel like this like romantic conflict was a little bit artificial, and maybe just to complicate the friendship between two of the characters. So I'm not like inherently against love triangles. I think it could be a realistic plot device. Like, love triangles happen in real life. They're like unrequited feelings between people, and people get jealous. It's a very human thing. But in this instance, I was a little bit unconvinced. So overall, I would say I recommend this book first and foremost to martial arts fans, and specifically fans of Bruce Lee. I really think it did a great job portraying the discipline of martial arts and all of the detailed choreography that comes with it. So it's got great action sequences if you enjoy those, but don't expect it to be a self-contained standalone, because it became very clear that there are more installments of this series planned, and the long journey, the long setup is to set up for future narrative events to come. And I do think the political world building is really well done here, portraying the prejudice between different groups of people and how much that was impacted by propaganda, which is highly relevant to today's political environment, I would say. So although I felt like it was a bit slow-moving and the character relationship wasn't my favorite, I am still curious what this series has to offer and what the following installment will bring us in terms of great action sequences and political conflicts. Blood of the Undying Throne by Sun-Il Kim. This is the 2025 sequel to Blood of the Old Kings, which just became available to English readers in 2024. I have made a video dedicated to this series that I will link down below, and I'll try not to repeat myself too much. This is a story set in an empire that runs on necromancy. So there are many sorcerers in this world, and after they die, their dead bodies are kept in special coffins and used as power generators for the empire. And they power soldiers and war machines for the empire to use to oppress the many kingdoms that make up this empire, and a lot of them want to break free from the empire's oppression and control. The first installment of this series is very fast-paced, action-packed, and it's a very inspiring story of ordinary people becoming heroes and stepping into the roles of leadership, really finding their purpose and inspiring their fellow countrymen in resisting the empire's oppression. So the second book is both a sequel and a prequel. It follows some of the characters dealing with the aftermath of the ending of book one, what happened when they made that fantastic stand against the empire and there was a brilliant battle, and some people have stepped into a position of power and now they're dealing with assassins, and the empire is also planning certain types of retaliation against the people that stood against them, and also there is an organization called the Office of Truth that have their own schemes and conspiracies, and politically this book has become quite a bit more complicated than the first one, and it also takes us to the ruins of a kingdom called Mercia, which was destroyed by kind of a fantasy weapon of mass destruction called the Star of Mercia, and one of the characters has traveled there to uncover the history of this kingdom and find out exactly what happened, what exactly is this weapon, and how it wiped out an entire kingdom. And we also find out more backstory about certain characters that played a major role in book one. I really appreciated this sequel for adding a lot of political complexity to this world, particularly some of the characters that I really liked in book one got more narrative focus and narrative space in this book, and you get to see more of their life story, things that happened in their past and people that they used to know and their interaction with them. And it did a really good job of fleshing out this kingdom that doesn't really exist anymore, of like describing this beautiful grassland and people living a nomadic herding life, just raising oxen, and the chief herder of the nation was kind of the de facto leader that had a lot of respect from the people and possibly even more powerful than the king or the prefect. So kind of seeing how it used to be and knowing that it had all been destroyed adds another layer to that kind of melancholy and dark feeling of this world. So kind of seeing everything that was and could have been for me as a reader really added this extra layer of melancholy and almost a feeling of nostalgia for a place that I have never even seen and really doesn't exist. It's all fiction. But I think the author did a very good job of painting more details into this world and fleshing out more characters' lives and history. But that being said, I don't think the second book was quite as exciting as the first one because the pacing I felt like slowed down a little bit, and when you're reading a backstory you don't really feel that same amount of tension as when characters are literally joining forces and marching to take a stand against the empire, which is what happened in book one. So this book overall felt a little bit slower and more subdued in its narration. And also, this is a personal matter, but I really didn't like the ending of book two. One of the characters made a very significant choice. That choice in itself didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and also what it would mean for the world just seems to spell chaos and destruction. So I really don't know how the author is going to tie it all together in book three. I do feel like there might be a little bit of a second book syndrome here. Just as readers, we always see like the middle installment of a sequel as just a path towards the true ending of the story. So it's probably quite common to not love the second book as much as the first book. However, I'm still really happy to have discovered this series, and I recommend that you watch the video that I describe the world and the characters in more detail, and I highly recommend that you check out this series. And I'm still very enthusiastic for the next release in this series to see how everything comes together and how the story truly ends. So I highly recommend that you check out this series starting from from Blood of the Old Kings, followed by Blood of the Undying Throne. The Manor of Dreams by Christina Lee. At first glance, this is a haunted house story that takes place at a mansion that was left behind by Vivian Yin, who was the first Chinese actress to ever win an Oscar. And at the reading of her will, there were two families present. One is Nora Deng and her mother Elaine Deng, and the others were Vivian's daughter Lucille and Rennie and Lucille's daughter Madeline. So they were Vivian's daughters and granddaughters. Needless to say, they expected to inherit the mansion because they were family. However, in her will, Vivian had left the mansion to the Deng family and only leaving her daughters $40,000 of inheritance to split between them. I mean, I say only $40,000 is a lot of money, but compared to the value of a mansion in a very highly priced area in LA left behind by a successful Oscar-winning actress, it did seem like peanuts. So the daughters are very unhappy, and we do later find out how the Deng family was related to Vivian at all and how they would receive this mansion, but the daughters were not satisfied at all, and Lucille, being a lawyer, suspected foul play, and she wanted to be able to stay in the mansion for a week to investigate exactly what happened to her mother, why her will was changed at the last minute, and why the house passed to the Deng family, and whether they had something to do with her mother's death. So these two families, with this powder keg-sized conflict between them, both ended up staying in this mansion, and they very quickly started to notice things are not right. They were seeing ghosts in the corner, dirt appearing in the sink, vines seemed to just appear out of nowhere inside the house, and unexplainable, horrendous nightmares, even the house itself shaking. And while dealing with all of this hostility and mutual suspicion, they slowly peel back the layers of mystery surrounding Vivian's life and exactly what happened during her lifetime and why she did not leave her own home to her own children. I have to say this book really surprised me because I went into it with the expectation of just reading a straightforward horror story, you know, a haunted house, there are ghosts and there are unexplainable movements and noises, things go bump in the night, things like that. So the first thing that very quickly stood out and really impressed me was how well the author controlled the release of information, like how slowly different facts are revealed and how as readers we only find out through hushed conversations that are overheard or a letter or a form that was found in a drawer. So we are kind of kept in the dark and living as like a fly on the wall in this haunted house and very slowly learn different pieces of this jigsaw puzzle as the characters discover them. And I think that really is one of the best things that authors can do to keep the mystery alive and really tightly control the reader's psychology and the reader's reaction when reading a mystery thriller like this. There's no like long expositions or long explanation of how things worked in the world. And when it comes to retelling Vivian's backstory, it really felt like movie scenes, like you're actually watching the action unfold of how Vivian met Richard, the words that passed between them, the looks, the furtive glances, and how things led to her receiving the Oscar, what happened during that awards ceremony. So even the long flashbacks didn't really feel like exposition. They're more like scenes that you were watching that was being recorded by a camera. And another thing that really impressed me was how deeply poignant this story is when it comes to the immigration experience, the diaspora, the cultural, let's say culture shock, the cultural incompatibility between Vivian and Richard, and everything that later happened in their family, like raising children that speak a different language as you do, and holding on to what seems like security and wealth, but giving up what's most important to you. All of these layers of how a manor of dreams turned into a manor of nightmare, all these things will stay with you and you will keep thinking about them after turning the last page and putting the book down. So overall, this story really surprised me and I really enjoyed it. It is so much more than a horror story. It is tense, full of shocking twists and turns, and it is haunting in the poignancy of the message contained in the story. So if you have not heard of The Manor of Dreams by Christina Lee, I highly recommend you check it out. What We Can Know by Ian McEwan. This is the brand new release from author Ian McEwan, who also wrote Amsterdam, which won the Booker Prize, and Atonement, which was adapted into a film featuring Keira Knightley and James McAvoy. This book was originally marketed as a sci-fi writing, but I don't really agree. I would say that this is a literary fiction with speculative elements. This story is set in 2119 when an English scholar called Thomas Metcalfe was researching the historical period of 1990 to 2030. So he was specifically researching a fictional poet called Francis Blundy, who had written a poem called A Corona for Vivian, which is dedicated to his wife, at a very famous dinner that took place in 2014. But when I started reading this book, I had thought it was a very interesting idea to consider like 10 years ago to be kind of distant history. That's like more than a century ago by the time that this story takes place. And when Thomas was piecing together what happened at this dinner that's being referred to as the second immortal dinner, he was reading through a lot of emails and tweets and just like personal social media accounts, which had become historical record. So that was initially a very interesting idea to me, because a lot of things that we put out onto the internet, including this video that you're watching, is kind of forever, isn't it? And one day, like all the tweets that people have posted and all the emails that they've exchanged will become historical record. And observing this, the author wrote, "We have robbed the past of its privacy," which I thought was such a beautiful idea. I even wrote it down. However, after the scene where the reading of the poem took place, I felt like the story quite literally lost the plot. So apparently Francis Blundy had written a 2,500-word poem dedicated to his wife Vivian on a piece of vellum, which is a type of leather, and then he supposedly destroyed it with all other drafts of his poetry, I guess to prevent the loss of this sense of privacy that the author is commenting on. So I was really enjoying the story in the beginning. I had felt it had this kind of antiquated feel, but in a very romantic way. So the events that are described in this story were taking place in 2014, but the way that the scenes were set and the way that the author described the story really made it feel a little bit antiquated, like it's a scene from a French salon in like the 18th century where a group of intellectuals would gather and exchange a lot of important ideas. I mean, it's called the Second Immortal Dinner, so you would imagine that this is kind of a groundbreaking event for literature in general or something, or maybe this poem held some kind of a code or some kind of secret that would explain the future that Tom is currently living in. However, after the scene where this poem was read and supposedly destroyed, I felt like the story quite literally lost the plot. So from that point on to the end of part 1, which was the entire middle third of the book, I feel like the book became more about ideas than story. So it was mostly Thomas lamenting the state of the world that he was living in, where most of the world was submerged by rising sea levels that was caused by climate disasters and also a nuclear accident that exacerbated the climate disasters. So then the ferry became a main point of transportation because so much of the world is underwater, and also something like 3/4 of the biodiversity of the entire world had been lost. So then it just became Thomas commentating on the state of the world, criticizing AI, having a random conversation with another passenger on the ferry about the stability of the English language and like struggles in his personal life. And the writing style of this book is quite like academic and dense. So let me put it this way: if you didn't enjoy Katabasis because you felt like it was a little bit too academic and a little bit haughty or snobbish, then you're extra not going to enjoy this book because it's very much written as a English scholar is talking, because it's very much meant to read like the like academic musings of a scholar of the English language, if that makes sense. I feel like there's definitely a degree of elitism both in the language and in the characterization, just in like who these main characters are and what they do and how they have this kind of exclusive little circle where they exchange ideas. And but when the story was more focused on the scholarly research of finding this poem, I feel like that highly intellectual and academic style really suited the story. But then after Thomas kind of got lost in his research, I as a reader also felt quite lost. And I still had this question of why is this poem so important and what is at stake for the world at large if it isn't found? And that question is never answered. And when Thomas later had a breakthrough on the research near the end of part 1, the story became about something else entirely. The story became about a different mystery that's about Vivian's marriage with Blondie and something that happened in their personal life, and how Vivian's first marriage broke down, which led to her being connected with Blondie. So I had wanted to DNF this book twice. First during that long middle part where I kind of lost the plot, and also when there was only 40 pages of the book left, but the mystery of how Vivian's first marriage ended had been answered, and I just kind of lost the motivation to continue reading, but I did push through to the end. Because I feel like part 2 was back to the style of Ian McEwan that I was more expecting, where he had this really strong narrative style, and once he really gets going with the story, it flowed very well. So I feel like part 2 had dropped that like highly scholarly, academic, almost snobbish kind of speech pattern, and it became more of an enjoyable like fiction to read. But I never really became terribly invested in the characters that are in this book. I never really felt connected with Thomas, and also like why his research was so important was never really answered. I still don't know why this poem matters so much the world at large. And just Francis and Vivian, I didn't really grow to care that much, to be completely honest with you. So then I really lost the motivation to find out the truth about their marriage and everything that led up to it. So although I felt like part 2 flowed better than part 1, and it reminded me more of that Ian McEwan writing style that I really liked from reading his past works, I still couldn't say that I overall enjoyed this book very much. I didn't really connect with the characters. I felt a little bit put off by the haughtiness of the language throughout most of part 1. And I feel like the stake of finding that poem was never really well set up. And the story also became about a different mystery entirely throughout the later parts. So although it had some very interesting ideas regarding the boundary of privacy and what we put out onto the internet, and also how much we kind of take our current environment for granted and how future generations will see our current state of the world as very precious, and just overall some great comments about how we view and understand the past. So although I loved those ideas, I didn't really connect with this story. And if you're reading it with the expectation of reading a science fiction, you would definitely be disappointed. But if you're interested in those ideas I just talked about, if you want to see Ian McEwan's take on it, I would say pick up this book with the expectation of reading a literary fiction with speculative elements. Death of the Author by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a story of a disabled Nigerian-American author called Zelu. So as she was going to her sister's lavish wedding in the Caribbean islands, she received a call from her university that she had been let go from her job teaching creative writing. So she used to be an adjunct professor there, but one day she made some very scathing comments about a piece of work that a white male student had turned in, and she gathered that her firing was kind of the retaliation of that. This, in combination with the fact that a novel that she had been working on for 10 years was rejected by yet another publisher through a form letter. So it wasn't even something personalized addressed to her, it's just a form rejection that they sent out to everyone. So this kind of became a turning point, or I guess a breaking point for her, and she decided to write a story that's just for herself, titled Rusted Robots. This is supposed to be a robot versus AI kind of story that's set in the future, and it's specifically set in Nigeria. This novel that she had written ended up becoming something of an overnight success, and it was picked up by a major studio, adapted into a film, but the film adaptation ended up whitewashing her novel, and Zelu noticed that a lot of people are starting to see the version in the film as the true story, and ignoring her original representation of Nigerian culture and language. In chapter 2 of this novel, the author briefly revealed what she meant by the phrase death of the author, and this was stated by that white male student that she had heavily criticized. What I think of my own work doesn't matter. The reader decides what it's about, right? Isn't that what you said death of the author meant? So I suppose the central idea here is that Zelu herself was experiencing this happening to her, where the readers were deciding what her story actually meant and kind of ignoring her original intention. But all this was buried in a very chaotic, highly fragmented plot and somewhat uninteresting writing. Zelu is part of a very large and very chaotic family, and I feel like the author was trying to give every member of the family like 15 minutes of fame. There were so many like interviews and first-person perspectives that are added from the perspectives of the family members, and they don't always add to the story. Some of them were just kind of different people rambling on about themselves. And also there's the issue of disability and how disability was perceived, and a professor offering to make Zelu an exoskeleton. And because she accepted this technology, people online were starting to say that she like turned her back against the disability community. It kind of briefly turned into yellowface for a while, just people online making like baseless accusations and quickly turning into this mob of negativity about someone that they know nothing about. And then there's also the story in story, the rusted robots that was thrown in here. But the story in story part, I feel like shares the same issue with the blind assassin, which is when you get this story in story that's kind of buried in another story, you never get quite enough to fully flesh out like a world or individual characters. It's just bits and pieces that feel like individual fragments, and they don't all put together very well, and they don't all thread into a complete sci-fi story. For that reason, I also disagree with labeling this book as sci-fi. I don't think it quite qualifies. I think it's literary fiction at its heart. And as a literary fiction, I don't think it did all that good a job with the writing itself. The language was a little bit too casual, and I don't think enough care had been taken to work on the rhythm and the flow of the sentences or the polishing of the language. That made the 435-page length feel even longer, and adding to the fact that the story is so fragmented among different perspectives and different issues that the author trying to all throw into this story, it ended up becoming a kitchen sink of a story. I can only guess that this story is probably self-referential, given that the author herself is disabled, and one of her previously published fictions called Lagoon is currently under adaptation in Steven Spielberg's company. So I'm curious if like something had gone a little bit wrong in that adaptation, or maybe she's voicing her worry that her own work would be whitewashed through writing a fiction about a disabled author's work being whitewashed. So that is like my best guess. But I also feel a little bit bad for being so critical of this story, because I can't think of another title that tackles this issue of writing versus adaptation versus reading. So overall, I really didn't enjoy reading this book. I think the central idea of what the authentic meaning of a story is as intended by the author versus how it can be misrepresented and misinterpreted, that's a good idea to wrestle with, but it's buried under so much chaos of fragmented perspectives, of just endless drabble from forgettable and unlikable characters, of family drama, sibling rivalry, possible jealousy, the immigrant experience of Nigerians in America, and drama in the personal relationship, and disability, and the help that she does or doesn't accept. Just so many things are thrown into this kitchen sink of a story, and the language itself was not enjoyable to read. So it really made the 435 pages a massive slog. I don't think this book qualifies as sci-fi at all, and I can't say that it lived up to the hype. So those were all the books that I read in November. I think this is the first month in the year where I've only read new releases that are from this year. So usually I would kind of have this wait and see attitude to see what books are still recommended a few years after it received a lot of hype and what books really stood the test of time. So this month, a few books really surprised me. I think two of my favorites, Seascraper and Atmosphere, I don't even have a physical copy of. And it was a really pleasant surprise listening to them and finding out how much I enjoyed these books. And I will definitely be keeping my eye out for a physical copy somewhere down the line. And I really enjoyed Katabasis, and I don't think you need to be intimidated by the academic nature of the book. It is about academia, and I think you can easily follow the story even if you don't know all of the references. And I think the Manor of Dreams and Red City really surpassed my expectation this month. I had thought one of them was a horror and the other was just a romance, but they both have really poignant themes that are about culture, immigration, identity, family, power, wealth, and crime. And there's just so much more to these stories, and I really enjoyed them. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's answered some of your questions about whether certain books you keep hearing about are actually worth the hype. And if there are certain 2025 new releases that you recommend to all of us, you think we should all check out, please leave them in the comments below. And please let us know, are there any new releases in 2026 that you're already looking forward to? Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.